sexy was used, but climate change does not have a resonance, it doesn't have a sexiness about it in Africa. And I think as a result of that, there is a failure to pick up on it in a meaningful way. It's picked up as one of the Labour guys said the other day in a meeting that Rahana and myself were in, it's picked up at a seasonal level. So whenever there's a big international meeting, okay, something will happen. But the reality is there's no consistency, and I think we share that. The other thing that is of concern is how the issue around climate in South Africa, in Africa, is very much written by foreign non-African journalists. And so if you open the media, you will see it's pulled down from the UK, it's pulled down from the US, about media pieces about Africa on climate change. And so we do lack a type of critical media in Africa talking about climate change in Africa. This takes me on to my second point, is that, you know, when a journalist gets to a road, to a car accident on the freeway, it's not about the 67 cars that have piled up, it's about the people. And I think that's the same thing which we need to start conveying and start thinking about when we talk about media journalism. And what came out earlier on today was this issue of me, and how when we're reporting and talking about climate change, we're talking about the person. Now, in my underground reality back in Durban, where I've worked for many years, when we started the environmental justice work in the early 90s, in the mid-90s, the reality was that there were no media covering environmental, social justice issues in the South Durban Basin. So you never got to hear of stories of the oil refinery. That would most probably come through once every 2 or 3 years when there's an accident and something big happens. But with a very big push by local people in South Durban in the mid-90s, pushing media that were quite hostile to this type of activism in the mid-90s, this environmental justice activism, pushing that media to actually turn was a phenomenal thing in South Durban. So if one looks at the filings, the stories filed in South Durban in that mid-90s to late 90s and 2000 period, you literally get stories, a couple of millimeters one year, nearly an inch the next year, 2 inches the next year. So the type of stories were picked up by the local media, and interestingly, at that level picked up also looking at this justice component. What is driving this environmental injustice? Not what the injustice is, but what are the fundamentals at driving it at below. There are a few journalists that I recognize do that, and Ingi Salgado from the independent newspapers, Tempelhof from Die Beeld, Carney from the Mercury, and Crotty, who's a freelancer, tends to pick up some of those underlying issues at times, rather than just conveying the story. But very much more, I believe, is needed of that. And, when you look at climate change today, you need to recognize that it doesn't happen, and I think, again, it was discussed early on, it doesn't happen in isolation of everything else. It happens in a world that is in crisis. We have a crisis of a financial crisis. We have an imperialist political crisis around the U.S., losing its grip. And we have then the environmental crisis as it's manifested by climate change. And so the reporting needs to start taking that those broader issues into consideration. Getting back to South Durban, the concern I have in terms of the South Durban people being very effective in pushing the media to an extent that it is regularly reported on, and that it is reported on from a social justice level, is that has that effectiveness got to a particular stage in South Durban or in Durban where actually it's been effective and then blanked out? So what happens is people started recognizing, wow, there's more than just people in South Durban living with pollution. They are questioning the underlying factors of it. And has that reporting got to a stage where it grew and was doing really well, and then society just blacked out on it? It got too much of it. And so I think there needs to be creative ways always in redefining our media and not just going with one particular approach. The third thing that I would like to talk about is the issue of the allure of the insider and accessibility and credibility of the way we convey our stories. We, as civil society, must take the blame, as NGOs specifically, must take the blame. We have the resources to intersect with media in ways that could change the way media reporting. Sometimes we just end up talking to ourselves. We don't manage to get those messages across in clear, factual manners, in a manner which people start thinking of and say, wow, yeah, that is right. Okay, now I understand what they're trying to say. So the climate change debate from a groundwork perspective is very much an energy debate. So it's not so much about climate change, but rather that in South Africa, climate change is linked to energy. Energy is linked to poor people on the ground. They don't have access to that energy. But on the other side, BHP Billiton has that. And so it's how to be able to work that narrative so that people can intersect with it. But at the real hub of this is we have to explain a bit of the science. We have to get that science message across in a way that people actually understand that. And today in the independent newspapers, I don't know if it was in the Star, you see David Rahl writing about Beware the Climate Imperialist, where he speaks very eloquently and references quite in detail why we are just a bunch of alarmists, he claims. And so I think that there's a type of rebuttal that is very clear about the issues, but brings in the politic so that people on the ground can understand it is critical in reporting. And the issue of taking that through and working with it in a type of infographic is something that we should. That is maybe somewhere where civil society has a strength, is to be able to bring these graphics through so that we can work with people. And some of the stuff that happened in adult education in the 80s and the 90s out of institutions at universities are tremendous in terms of how they brought through concepts of power and how we have to challenge the apartheid state. So that is important. The fourth thing I'd like to look at is just the media in this particular era now as we stand here, questioning government. So what is happening in the type of media for the COP, this run-up to this COP, is very much what government is throwing out. Now, is it because there are not enough seasoned journalists in the newsrooms to actually make more out of this process? I think, Sue is lucky, Sue is fortunate, but does Sue have people that she can work with so that she's not the lone person standing there having to bring this reality out? And that's the concern. The juniorization of the newsrooms lead to the type of COP reporting being very much come press release, bang it on, get some of the color, get Gary Player on a bicycle, take a photo of him, and that's your COP coverage. But not actually looking at, so what are the social justice issues linked with COP? And then you get, where you do then fall short is that you get the likes of Greenpeace, who then does the big action. That big action goes up for one day, everybody focuses in on it, and it's great, but then the next day it's no more there. Because there was no creative, there was no strong journalist to be able to take that narrative through. Greenpeace itself is not wanting to do that, but what they are good at is making the big bang. And so, but how do we take that forward? And we need a journalism that cuts through that. And then finally, if I may, I don't know how my time is going, but if you then look at what had come up around objectivity of journalism, positions versus telling stories, driving an agenda, taking position, And, you know, it is important that journalism does convey what the truth is and what the reality is. And so this sense of saying that we are journalists and we're going to be going down the middle path is not the route that any, you know, seasoned journalist, I believe, would take. They would present the stories. They should be informing society's thinking rather than just reporting in a very bland manner in what has happened. And I think that the three, Brendan, Sue, and Prof, did understand that, and I think are recognizing that that should happen. You know, the reality is that you will still find, you know, full-page stories on climate denialist in the paper. But the interesting thing in understanding the story is that there was very little from speaking to the journalists at the Mercury. There was very little that they could pick up that countered this in a way in which it presented its information. So they searched media globally, they searched media in South Africa, but this got on because it was well articulated, it was strong, but there was nothing else that could come on. And so I think it's important for us as civil society to bring that information on in an understandable and meaningful manner, and secondly, encourage journalism to be able to question the justice, the social issues, and the power dynamics that lie in the very stories that happen with climate change on the ground. On the Medupi and Kusile power station, and on the claim of those power stations servicing poor people's energy needs and those power stations servicing jobs, the facts and figures never came out. And for many years before this, we were saying that that is an issue, that the power stations are built mainly to service the type of energy demands by major foreign direct investment, which was created by a bad development paradigm in the past. The government couldn't leave it, it had to stick with it. But it wasn't equating to jobs. And so we weren't getting press until Zille stood up and said it. And then what Zille was saying in an interview between 8 and 9 o'clock one morning with Kolani was exactly everything Patrick Bond said, everything that communities were saying on the ground, but Zille was saying it, so she was given that space to say it. So that is the one thing. And the second thing is that I have not seen, again, the example in South Durban is simple. From 1995 to 2002, you get a series of industrial expansions. EIAs coming left, right, and center. And if you go into the office with Nawala's, you will see files of environmental impact assessments for new facilities. Jobs decreased. And that was the global monitor employed by the city to look at jobs in South Durban. So this development was going, and jobs are going the other way. And so for me, I'm trying to understand, why can't we get that message across? What are we doing wrong as civil society to be able to counter government